One sudden nighttime shattered the boundaries of friendship, leaving my coronary heart divided between love and preference and a developing temptation I could not forget about. It is extraordinary how a quiet moment can suddenly feel unsettling. I lay there in mattress, being attentive to the low hum of the air, conditioning each sound amplified inside the stillness. My husband had left earlier for a quick trip, promising he'd be back by using morning. The night stretched out earlier than me, and though the residence changed into familiar, an eerie part lingered within the silence, filling the shadows with unstated possibilities. I flipped through the TV channels for a chunk, trying to distract myself, but nothing held my interest. I eventually gave up, became off the mild and rolled over, hoping sleep could come quick. However, something felt off. You realize that feeling you get like a person's watching. I felt that kickback move slowly up my spine, a quiet pain I could not shake. I sat up, glanced across the darkened room, and instructed myself it become just my imagination. I settled go into reverse, pulling the covers up and ultimate my eyes, specializing in steadying my breath. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It hung there heavy and hectic, lingering in the shadows around me. Abruptly, there was a faint creak from the hallway, the kind of sound that makes you sit up straight and concentrate only a little closer. The sound wasn't loud, only a barely there shuffle of footsteps. My heart pounded as I sat frozen, straining to listen. Perhaps it became the pipes, I instructed myself. But then the sound got here again, clearer. This time a person became there. I lay backtrack, figuring out it had to be not anything. However, the footsteps did not forestall. They grew louder, nearer, and that I ought to experience the figure coming near the bedroom door. My heart was pounding so difficult I felt like it would burst. I did not need to appearance. I didn't need to understand. However, interest were given the better of me, and I glanced over at the entrance, praying. It was just my mind playing hints. Status there, bathed in the dim light from the hallway, become Mark, my husband's first-rate pal. He was watching me, his eyes sharp, nearly studying me. It felt invasive, a gaze that regarded to reach proper into me. I managed to faint, at a loss for words, smile, hoping it would dissolve the unusual atmosphere, but he did not return it. Hello. I whispered, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Is the whole thing okay? Mark hesitated, then stepped into the room, his gaze unwavering. His presence stuffed the distance with ordinary intensity, and I felt a prickle of unease. Sorry. He finally stated, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't imply to wake you. I concept you may want some business enterprise, being by myself and all. I gave a quick laugh, hoping to lighten the temper, but my snort felt whole, strained. I did not assume anyone. I said. Trying to preserve my voice consistent, he moved nearer, settling himself into the chair by means of the window, only a few toes from the bed. I watched him, feeling like I used to be trapped in some atypical dream. I advised myself to relax. Mark became my husband's oldest buddy, someone I'd recognized for years. However, something about the way he was sitting there quietly watching me felt unique. Tonight there has been in strength in the room, an unspoken tension that made the hairs at the lower back of my neck arise. So, did my husband ask you to test on me? I asked, breaking the silence. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving mine. Number, I simply desired to ensure you were all right. You seemed like you may use some business enterprise. It became this sort of easy assertion, yet it carried a weight that made me shiver. His gaze turned into severe, looking as though he ought to examine every thought that crossed my mind. I felt a peculiar, nearly magnetic pull, something I hadn't felt earlier then, and it both intrigued and unsettled me. I tried to brush it off, transferring below the covers and letting out a small sigh. I admire it, Mark, however I think I'm nice. I said, my voice trailing off, uncertain if I even believed my personal phrases. However, he did not circulate. As a substitute, he leaned again inside the chair, his eyes still locked onto mine, and a faint smile crept onto his lips, one which seemed to hide something deeper. There has been something unique approximately him tonight, something greater guarded, but nearer. The silence among us grew thicker, charged with a depth I hadn't anticipated. It turned into like a recreation, a silent dare to see who could destroy first. "Do you ever experience trapped?" he requested. Unexpectedly, his voice smooth but pointed. The query caught me off defend. "Trapped?" I repeated, harassed. "Yeah, like you're dwelling on lifestyles. You didn't precisely pick just one you ended up in." His words had been low, contemplative, but there was something below them, something that felt like a confession. I opened my mouth to reply, but no words came out. I wasn't certain what he turned into getting at, but the query lingered in the air and I felt it echo in my personal mind. Had I felt trapped in this lifestyles on this marriage, it was something I would never sincerely allowed myself to consider. From time to time, I whispered sooner or later, nearly amazed with the aid of my very own answer. But does not all and sundry sense that way? At least as soon as he nodded, a shadow crossing his face. I think a number of us sense it greater than others. Maybe it is just about locating someone who is familiar with the weight of his phrases hung inside the air, and that I felt something shift between us. His gaze softened, and for a brief moment the tension felt nearly comforting. I found out then how close he turned into sitting, his presence filling the gap with an unusual warm temperature that felt each safe and perilous. I turned away, breaking eye contact, looking to gather my thoughts. "Mark, I don't know what you are getting at, but I'm just being honest." He interrupted, his voice low and consistent. "Every so often we do not recognize what we want till it is right in front, folks." The quietness of his words struck me as if he had been laying something bare, something he hadn't meant to proportion. And in that moment I felt an ordinary flutter of exhilaration, blended with worry, a thrill I hadn't felt in years. However, before I should react, he stood up, breaking the spell that had been keeping us captive. "I need to move," he said, his tone softer, now nearly regretful. It was first-rate speaking. I nodded, unable to discover the proper words, watching as he moved in the direction of the door. But just as he reached it, he paused, glancing back with a look I could not quite vicinity. There was something unstated in his expression, something that left me with a lingering sense of curiosity and unease. As the door closed at the back of him, I exhaled, feeling a rush of emotions I couldn't absolutely recognize. The nighttime became silent once more, but it became a one-of-a-kind type of silence, one that felt charged and alive. I sat there in bed, gazing the door, feeling an odd feel of anticipation. However, the tale wasn't over, no longer yet. I notion I could shake off the atypical come upon with Mark, chalk it as much as simply an ordinary one-time second. But the subsequent day, as I went approximately my normal recurring, he turned into all I could reflect on, consideration on. His words had stayed with me, the manner he checked out me, lingering like an echo that refused to fade. I was seeking to push it all out of my mind. Whilst my smartphone buzzed with a message, glancing down, I noticed it changed into from him. "Are you free this afternoon? Concept we may want to seize an espresso." A simple question, innocent on the surface, but it added back that odd blend of exhilaration and unease. I hesitated, earlier than typing back a response. Sure. An hour later, I discovered myself sitting across from him in a quiet corner of a restaurant. We might both been to countless instances with my husband, however this time it felt different. Mark checked out me with that same targeted depth, as though he should see proper via me immediately to mind. I hadn't even admitted to myself. "Thank you for coming," he stated, his voice warm but careful, as though we had been both strolling on a tightrope. We hadn't even found out we were balancing on no problem. "I used to be surprised to pay attention from you. Honestly," I replied, seeking to keep my tone informal. Though my pulse changed into racing, he leaned lower back, taking a sluggish sip of his espresso. I simply thought after ultimate night it might be suitable to speak. I did not need you to think I used to be out of line. I may want to sense my face flush. It became simply an unexpected go-to. That is all. I answered, hoping to clean over the lingering awkwardness. However, he did not appear glad. Perhaps it is extra than that, he said, decreasing his gaze for a second before meeting my eyes again. Every now and then people become in every other's lives at odd instances, for motives we do not constantly recognize proper away. His phrases had been simple, however they struck a chord. I failed to want to admit it, even to myself, however there has been a pull among us. I could not ignore. And judging by the manner he looked at me, it turned into something he felt too. So what is honestly taking place? I requested, seeking to keep the communique on safer ground. You haven't exactly been yourself recently. He paused, his gaze moving out the window for a moment as though collecting his thoughts. I bet it is simply everything, lifestyle selections I might made for myself, after which understanding maybe they weren't my selections at all. You ever experience that way? His words hit me more difficult than I predicted, stirring up emotions I'd been trying to forget about. My own marriage had settled into something comfortable, predictable. I cherished my husband, of path, but sometimes I wondered if we might grown too at ease, if we'd misplaced the spark that had as soon as made everything experience so alive. On occasion I admitted softly, feeling a pang of guilt for saying it out loud. It's clean to fall right into a routine, and then you forget about what it seems like to truly live. He nodded, information in his eyes. I assume we all crave something extra, but the majority in no way admit it. There was a weight to his phrases, something that made me experience both exhilarated and anxious. I desired to keep matters light, to pretend that there wasn't a growing tension among us, but the greater we talked, the greater I felt like I used to be on the edge of something I could not control. So what are we supposed to do approximately it? I asked, half of joking. Even though my voice came out shaky, he didn't answer proper away, his gaze lingering on me. I suppose this is the query, isn't it? For a moment we simply sat there, the noise of the cafe fading into the history. My mind became spinning with mind I failed to need to entertain, emotions I did not need to well known. However, the manner he looked at me with that calm, unwavering gaze made it not possible to foe. I did not experience the same pull. Simply then, a familiar voice broke the spell. Oh. Hi there, failed to count on to peer you two here. It turned into considered one of our mutual friends smiling at us with a touch of curiosity. I forced a smile, my heart nevertheless racing as I exchanged pleasantries as she walked away. I let out a shaky breath, figuring out how near we might come to crossing an invisible line. We have to likely get going, I murmured, feeling just like the room became too small, the partitions too close. He nodded, status up without every other word. However, as we walked out of the cafe, I ought to experience his presence beside me, his quiet depth filling the gap between us. The times that followed had been a strange blur. I attempted to focus on my regular ordinary, but the entirety felt exceptional. My thoughts saved drifting returned to him, his words, his gaze, the manner he appeared to understand, things I hadn't even completely understood about myself. I couldn't shake the sensation that something had shifted, that there was no going return to the way things were. And then one afternoon, he stopped by means of the house. I hadn't expected him, however, after I opened the door there, he became standing with that acquainted expression, a combination of warmth and something deeper, something that made my heart pass a beat. Are we able to communicate? He asked, his tone soft but insistent. I glanced around, making sure no one else changed into home, then nodded, letting him in. We stood in the hallway for a moment, neither of us speaking, the silence, heavy with all the things we weren't pronouncing. I simply. He commenced, his voice slightly a whisper. I cannot stop considering you approximately us, and I understand it's incorrect. But I felt my breath seize my coronary heart racing as his words sank in. Mark, we can't, this is not. But he stepped closer, his gaze consistent, and I discovered myself not able to turn away. There was something approximately the manner he looked at me, as though he could see right by all the walls I might build up, as if he understood parts of me I didn't even understand existed. It's not presupposed to make experience, he murmured. But I recognize you experience it too. His phrases hung in the air, and that I found out with an aggregate of worry and pleasure that he changed into right. There was something undeniable among us, something that defied good judgment, something I couldn't ignore. But simply as the anxiety reached its height, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway jolted us both lower back to reality. I stepped back, my coronary heart pounding as I peeked out the window. My husband became domestic. Mark took a step returned too, his expression unreadable. I should go, he stated quick, his voice barely above a whisper. I failed to mean to place you on this position. I nodded, trying to steady my breath. It's okay, why? But maybe it's excellent if we preserve our distance. He checked out me, a flash of remorse in his eyes, then nodded, you are right. This isn't fair to either folks. He grew to become to leave, and I watched him cross my thoughts, a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. Part of me desired to forestall him, to tell him to stay, to throw warning to the wind and notice wherein this unusual connection might take us. However, some other part of me knew that this turned into risky, that it can resolve everything I'd constructed with my husband. As I watched him walk away, I felt a pang of loss, as though something crucial changed into slipping through my palms. However, there was no time to dwell on it. My husband became already commencing to the front door, greeting me along with his regular clean smile. Howdy, honey, he stated, pulling me right into a hug. How turned into your day? I forced a smile, trying to push all thoughts of Mark from my thoughts. It turned into satisfactory, I answered, my voice sounding abnormal even to myself. But as I went about the night cooking dinner, speak me approximately our days, I could not shake the lingering sense of something unresolved, something that hung inside the air like a query ready to be answered. And that I knew deep down that this become only the start. The story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. Days passed, but the reminiscence of that afternoon with Mark lingered. A quiet flame that refused to die. I tried to push it from my mind to consciousness on my marriage, my home, the existence I might build. However, the more I tried to forget about, the more potent the memory have become. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, his excessive gaze, the quiet manner he listened, as though he ought to pay attention to things I wasn't saying. It became like a melody stuck in my head, one which played softly within the historical past of each conversation. Every idea I hadn't seen him seeing that afternoon, and a part of me become relieved. But some other part, the part one did not want to renounce, ignored him. It missed the manner he made me experience, the way he looked at me, the thrill of being visible in a way I hadn't felt in years. I instructed myself it would fade, that it was only a passing moment, a spark that might ultimately flicker out. However, deep down I knew higher. It was a quiet night whilst he showed up again. My husband had long gone out to fulfill a few vintage pals, and I used to be on my own folding laundry inside the residing room while there has been a knock on the door. I opened it, half watching for to look a neighbor or a transport. However, there he became, standing in the doorway. His expression as conflicted as I felt. Mark, I stated, my voice slightly above a whisper. What are you doing right here? He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. I simply had to see you, he admitted, his voice gentle, however resolute. I realize I should not be here. However, I can't preserve pretending. I do not sense this manner. I felt my coronary heart quicken, my pulse racing as he stepped internal, closing the door quietly at the back of him. The room felt smaller with him in it, the air charged with interest that neither folks should forget about. I desired to tell him to depart, to insist that this became wrong, that we could not hold pushing the limits of what became appropriate. However, the phrases wouldn't come. Neither of us dared to move. As a substitute, we stood there inches aside, the silence stretching among us like a bridge. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and that I felt a shiver run through me, a spark igniting on the simple touch. I knew I ought to shy away, however I couldn't. It became as if all of the reasons, all the logical explanations melted in the warmth of his hand. "Are you going to inform me to depart?" He requested, his voice slightly above a whisper, his gaze unwavering. I swallowed, my throat all at once dry. "I don't know if I'm able to." He took a step closer, his hand transferring to my shoulder, his contact gentle, however firm. The world seemed to vanish away, leaving only the two folks suspended in a moment that felt both forbidden and inevitable. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath heat towards my cheek, and that I felt myself attracted to him like a moth to a flame. "You do not have to say something," he murmured, his voice low, comforting. "If that is an excessive amount of, just inform me and I will depart." I knew I have to say something, have to put a prevent to something was occurring between us. But as an alternative, I discovered myself final the gap, my fingers resting on his shoulders as his fingers wrapped round me, pulling me nearer. It was as if the load of all of the unspoken phrases, the hidden glances, the moments of lingering anxiety eventually broke unfastened. He kissed me, his lips tender and tentative, as if testing the waters, and that I felt myself melt into him, the warmth of his touch, grounding me, soothing the war that had been brewing inside me. It wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate. It changed into mild, consistent, just like the sluggish burn of something that were ready patiently to be stated. The world out of doors disappeared, and in that second it turned into simply him, just us, a quiet give up to something we would each been trying to deny. He pulled, returned barely, his gaze searching mine, and that I should see the identical combination of emotions, guilt, pleasure, longing, contemplated in his eyes. "Are you okay?" he requested softly, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my coronary heart pounding. "I simply do not know what this indicates." He took my hand, guiding me to sit down beside him at the couch, and for a second we surely sat there, aspect with the aid of side, his hand resting on mine. There has been no need for words, no one to give an explanation for what we both already understood. We had crossed a line, and there was no going lower back. But in that quiet area, the worries, the questions, the doubts faded, changed through the easy fact of the instant. "I never intended for this to appear," he admitted. Ultimately, his voice raw, vulnerable. "However, I cannot pretend anymore. I care about you greater than I need to." I checked out him, my thoughts, a whirl of conflicting thoughts. "I comprehend it's wrong," I whispered, my voice trembling, "but I cannot help it either." For an eternal second our bodies swayed together, the air thick with unstated feelings. The space among us dissolved, our hearts beating as one, helpless against our desire. We succumbed to the pull. He leaned in, his lips whispering against mine, smooth and cautious, as if fearing the fragile connection would shatter. This time all doubts vanished. I melted into his embrace, our love a flame that engulfed us. Every boundary blurred, our souls intertwining. We sat there wrapped in every other's palms, the world outside slipping away. It turned into a moment suspended in time, a quiet rise up towards the lives we were supposed to be dwelling. And in that stolen second, the whole thing felt right. But because the minutes exceeded, truth began to creep lower back in, bringing with it the load of what we had carried out. I pulled, returned my gaze, dropping to the ground, a wave of guilt washing over me. I pulled, returned my gaze, dropping to the ground, a wave of guilt washing over me. This made manifest again. I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his expression resigned. I recognize, however it doesn't alternate how I sense. This may manifest again. I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his expression resigned. I recognize, however it doesn't alternate how I sense. I looked at him, my heart aching. Then what are we imagined to do? He let loose a sigh, his hand nonetheless resting on mine. I don't know. Maybe we simply ought to let this move. The words felt whole, and I knew deep down that letting move wouldn't be as simple because it sounded, but as plenty as I desired to hold directly to him, to dangle to the warmth of his presence. I knew it became not possible. We have been gambling with fire, and ultimately we might both get burned. He stood up, his gaze lingering on me for a second before he grew to become to go away. If you ever want me, I'm right here, he said softly, a touch of unhappiness in his voice. However, I may not put you in this position once more. I watched him go, my coronary heart heavy with the load of our unspoken goodbye. The door closed behind him and the silence settled over me, a chilly reminder of the road we had crossed, the boundary we had damaged. I sat there on my own inside the quiet house, the memory of his touch still heat against my skin, a reminder of a choice I couldn't take lower back. And as I sat there, the reality of what I had done started out to sink in, bringing with it a wave of regret and confusion. I had betrayed my husband, my vows, the life I had constructed. But I had also located something I hadn't even found out. I used to be searching for a connection, a spark, a feeling that went beyond the secure confines of my marriage. I didn't recognize what the destiny held, did not know if I ought to ever without a doubt put this in the back of me. However, one factor turned into certain: the tale wasn't over, now not but. The days that followed were a blur. I went about my routines trying to find comfort inside the familiar rhythms of daily existence. However, the whole thing felt hollow, tainted. I stored replaying that second with Mark, the softness of his contact, the unspoken phrases we had shared. On every occasion I notion about it, guilt might upward thrust in my chest. Yet along it got here, a pang of something I couldn't ignore, a craving, a curiosity about what might have been. My husband did not seem to notice my distracted demeanor, or maybe he chalked it up to the same old stress of existence. He'd been busier than ever with work, coming home overdue, worn out and preoccupied. I need to have felt relieved that he hadn't observed something was off, but one way or the other that simplest delivered to the pain. It changed into as although we had been residing separate lives, every of us absorbed in our personal worlds, orbiting around each different without virtually connecting. One night, a week after that closing second with Mark, my husband counseled we host a small dinner for a few friends, together with Mark. The concept took me by a wonder, and a wave of anxiety washed over me. I hadn't visible Mark in view that night time, and the idea of being within the identical room pretending that nothing had passed off became nearly insufferable. However, I forced a grin, nodding in settlement, knowing I had little choice. The night of the dinner arrived, and I busied myself inside the kitchen seeking to distract myself from the anxiety-building interior me. I centered on the familiar obligations, slicing greens, stirring sauces, putting the table, whatever to maintain my thoughts occupied. However, as the clock ticked in the direction of the time our guests were due to arrive, my heart started out to race. I may want to already experience the load of what was to come, the anxiety that simmered just underneath the surface, ready to erupt. The doorbell rang, and I braced myself, wiping my palms on a towel. As I went to answer it, Mark stood there, a heat smile on his face, searching as even though nothing had happened, as though we had been nevertheless just friends sharing an harmless bond. But the moment our eyes met, I felt the familiar pull, the quiet know-how that lingered between us, a connection that words could not capture. "Hiya," he said softly, his gaze lingering on me a 2D longer than essential. "Thanks for inviting me." I compelled a smile, nodding as I stepped aside to let him in. "It turned into my husband's idea," I answered, my voice barely a whisper, "but I'm satisfied you came." As the nighttime spread out, I found myself slipping into the function I might perfected through the years, the attentive hostess, the loving spouse, the best friend. I laughed on the proper moments, joined in on conversations, and did my high quality to preserve my composure, all at the same time as feeling Mark's presence like a shadow, a reminder of the line we had crossed. However, once in a while our eyes would meet throughout the room and I'd feel a rush of emotion, a combination of longing and guilt that left me breathless. He did not attempt to speak to me by myself, failed to deliver any sign of what had occurred among us. However, I should feel it within the air, an invisible thread that related us, binding us in a manner that neither people may want to forget about. Because the nighttime wore on, the anxiety only grew, constructing with each passing glance, each shared silence. It became as though the walls had been lashed in around us, trapping us in a secret that neither people knew the way to escape, after which sooner or later it had become too much. I excused myself, heading to the kitchen to clean my head, hoping the solitude would help me regain manage. But simply as I began to acquire my thoughts, I heard the gentle click on of the door, and that I turned to discover Mark's status there, his expression serious, his eyes packed with the equal conflicted emotions. "I felt I needed to see you," he said, his voice low, slightly audible. I could not go away without pronouncing goodbye. I felt my heart clench, the weight of his phrases hitting me with an intensity one hadn't expected. "Goodbye," I echoed, my voice shaky. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't honest to either of us. We both comprehend it cannot cross on like this. You've got an existence, a wedding. I can't be the cause you throw it all away." I swallowed hard, feeling a combination of relief and heartbreak. He turned into proper. We had both crossed a line and there was no going back. However, while I tried to convince myself, it became for the satisfactory. I felt in pain deep in my chest, a feel of loss that I could not shake. "Maybe it's for the nice," I whispered, seeking to believe it. "We can't maintain pretending like this. Will not do any harm all people round us." He took a step closer, his gaze softening. "However, it doesn't trade the manner I feel. And I do not think it modifications the manner you sense both." The honesty in his phrases took my breath away, and that I felt tears prick my eyes. I desired to tell him he changed into wrong, to insist that we may want to move lower back to the manner matters were. However, I knew it was a lie. There was no undoing what had happened between us, no erasing the emotions that had grown quietly over the years. He reached out, his hand brushing towards mine, and for a quick moment I allowed myself surrender to the warmth of his touch, the quiet comfort it supplied. We stood there wrapped in a silence that spoke louder than words, a shared know-how that this became goodbye, that we needed to allow each other go. Simply then I heard footsteps approaching and I pulled away, my coronary heart pounding as I became lower back to the sink, forcing myself to appearance busy. My husband entered, oblivious to the silent exchange that had simply taken vicinity, and I felt a pang of guilt as he wrapped his fingers around me, urgent a gentle kiss to my cheek. "Are you all proper?" he requested, problem flickering in his eyes. I forced a smile, nodding as I leaned into his include, just a little tired. That's all. He gave me a reassuring squeeze, and I felt a wave of shame wash over me. Here became the man who had given me the entirety, who had stood with the aid of me through thick and skinny. And yet I had allowed myself to be pulled into a whirlwind of emotions I hadn't been organized for. Because the evening got here to and give up, and our visitors started out to depart, I discovered myself looking Mark one closing time, memorizing the traces of his face, the way his eyes softened. Whilst he checked out me, he offered a polite goodbye, his gaze lingering for just a moment before he grew to become and walked out the door, leaving at the back of a vacancy that settled closely inside the room. Whilst the door closed, I felt an unusual experience of finality, a quiet popularity that this bankruptcy turned into over. But whilst I tried to transport forward to place it all at the back of me, I knew that a part of me would always convey the memory of that forbidden connection. The sensation of being seen, understood in a manner I hadn't regarded, turned into feasible. Days turned into weeks, and gradually the depth of that nighttime diminished, replaced by the habitual of daily existence. My husband and I continued as we constantly had, and in time the reminiscence of Mark had become just that, a memory, a fragment of a life that could were, however by no means would be yet. Once in a while I'd capture myself thinking of him, questioning in which he became if he had located peace in his very own manner. I'd in no way recognize, and possibly that turned into for the high quality. However, in those quiet moments, whilst the sector turned into nevertheless and the night time stretched out before me, I'd experience a flicker of that same quiet longing, a reminder of a connection that had changed me in methods I hadn't predicted. And even though I would by no means say it out loud, I knew that Mark had left an imprint on my heart, one that would linger lengthy after the reminiscence of our time together had diminished. Some stories don't have perfect endings, they don't result in happiness or heartbreak or decision, they without a doubt waft into the past, becoming part of who we are, a reminder of the choices we made, the humans we loved, and the lives we nearly lived. And as I stood there, staring out the window on the quiet street underneath, I knew that Mark might continually be part of my tale, a secret, a whisper, a fleeting moment of something more.